My name is David DeRozier. I am the president of the RealClear Foundation, publisher of RealClearPolitics, and it's a pleasure to put these virtual brain trusts on. I should note all you smart guys on the screen. There are about close to 80 people who are similarly smart watching us, and I hope we can put on a good show. The idea behind these basically has always been that research of the kind that we're going to discuss today, really needs, I think, a reception like this, where we kind of create a group of people who are capable of understanding it, but also looking through it from their own perspective. And I think the people that we put together here are very smart, but also very complementary. I mean, just going down the line as far as I see it, when I do mention your name, you could wave. We have Mark Mills here, right? Wave, Mark. Art, you did the salute. That's better. Mark is one of the smartest guys that I know, including Rupert and everybody else here on energy. But really, when it comes time for the fundamental sciences and how actually innovations and reforms actually make it out of the lab and into the economy, he also has a new position as a distinguished senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Institute. Congratulations on that, Mark. And move to the right, we got my friend Andy Pusner, who's former CEO of Carl's Jr. He is a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation, I believe, but he's also the author, of a great book on capitalism and its comeback. The new guy down on the list is Buddy Menton. I mean, he's new to our thing, but Buddy is one of my kind of famous lawyers, but he's great on the issue of energy. Usually when one sees a lawyer, they're very good with their words and their writing. Buddy's very good with that, plus math. And if you look at his blog, The Manhattan Contrarian, I think you'll see a level of public policy thinking and writing that is really extraordinary. And then, Terence Keeley. Terence is, like Andy, someone who comes to this group and has a great understanding about how markets work. And, really has been, kind of a leader on Wall Street. He left his other firm with a nice departure of actually a book called Sustainability, which really kind of made the argument of why his former employer was going down the wrong road with ESG. And he has another, I can't even read that. What is that?
It's sustainability is now out in German. It's now out in German for those of you who would rather prefer German.
Yeah. And, then I'll just jump down to Joel, is that, people in the ideas community like to think ideas have consequences. And I think there's not a better person that gives human expression to those consequences than my favorite demographer, Joel Kotkin, who's on the line. And his book, I think, shows what I think to be the logic of this kind of run to net zero. His recent book is on the new neo-feudalism. So I think, Rupert, you're going to be talking in your paper how we're getting back to the 1780s in terms of Britain and their productivity. I mean, I think he's the Dickens of our story here. And then with that, I'll just turn it over to Rupert, whose paper we're here to discuss today. One of the things that we wanted to do at RealClear is we always try to actually bring in what's not readily available here. And in Rupert, we always saw someone who understood the world that we live in as Americans, but also saw it from a European perspective. And it seems like everything that's, once it comes to us late. Usually we start things with this whole net zero environmental stuff. I mean, I think we're late to the party. And I think the purpose of Rupert's paper to say, what's going to be coming to a rate card near us is going to be terrifying, and it's going to have real world consequences on our economy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rupert.
Well, thank you so much, David. So the topic of discussion is net zero. Net zero is the biggest government experiment ever undertaken in the supposedly free countries of the West. And we know how that experiment will end. But as Adam Smith said on hearing of the defeat of the British at the hands of George Washington and the American rebels, there is a great deal of ruin in a nation. So the question is just how much ruin before the net zero experiment is aborted. America is in a more fortunate position than Britain because thanks to the Trump presidency, it's a late starter to it. And when it comes to energy, there are two Americas. Dickens talked about, actually, Disraeli talked about two nations, but there are two Americas when it comes to to energy. There's the free enterprise America of oil and gas production. And if you look at the numbers, it's been booming. Last August, US production of crude oil surpassed its pre-pandemic peak. Natural gas production is even more buoyant, is now running about 8% higher than its pre-pandemic level. True, the increases during the Biden years have been paltry compared to the first 3 years of Trump before the pandemic. Oil output grew twice as fast. Natural gas grew 3 times faster. But then there's the other America, the electrical grid, in effect run by, or rather ruined by, the EPA, progressive state politicians, and the climate industrial complex. Net zero is the policy of the Biden administration. It has the goal of decarbonizing the grid by 2035. No coal, no natural gas, lots and lots of wind and solar, EV mandates to push gasoline-powered vehicles off the road and force people to rely on a badly compromised grid to power their autos. So Britain's experiment with net zero has much to tell us what lies in store for the US should Americans vote for net zero come November. The first thing to observe is that, contrary to the claims made by the climate industrial complex, renewable energy is very, very expensive. 15 years ago, the British energy market was dominated by 6 vertically integrated energy companies, the so-called Big Six. Because of their market power, the energy regulator required them to file segmented financial and operating data. And so what I've done is gone into that data and pulled out what seemed to me some really big points from that data. So what we have here, this is looking at revenues per megawatt hour. And what you see in the top green lines is renewable average revenue per megawatt hour. In normal parlance, that's the price they're getting for each megawatt hour they sell. What you can see is that it's around twice the level in the bottom lines that the thermal power stations, that is coal and natural gas fired, and then nuclear, which is the grey line. So you're looking at renewables would be getting well over £100 per megawatt hour, whereas the average price that the thermal generators were getting was more like £52 a megawatt hour, and nuclear down at £41 per megawatt hour. And although fuel input costs for coal and natural gas were more or less flat over that period, there was a tripling of environmental levies, and those levies are used to fund renewable subsidies, which rose in 1 year. They rose from £334 million in 2013 to over £1 billion in 2014. Those are very, very big numbers. And together with carbon taxes, the impact of carbon taxes, this led the Big Six to take massive write-downs on their thermal power stations, and they recorded a £1.6 billion loss before interest and taxes in 2014. And here you can see the perversity of renewable subsidies. The green lines at the top, the renewable lines, which because of subsidies get over twice the price of the power that you get to keep the lights on, effectively being subsidized by the lines at the bottom, by the red and blue lines. And if we then look at profits, you'll see this is even more extreme. That in 1 year, so again, the 2 green lines are the EBIT, the earnings before interest and tax per megawatt hour for renewables, and in 1 year, the price that the profit they were getting was actually higher than the price that the thermal generators were obtaining. Now, there's a wrinkle in all this, but to keep the lights on, the British government created a capacity market. So they basically paid some thermal generators to maintain their power stations on standby. And the cost of the power, that when they drew it down, is also extremely expensive. For one power generator, it was £224 per megawatt hour. That was in 2020. This very expensive electricity properly forms part of the costs of wind and solar, costs which I should emphasize are routinely ignored in cost comparisons between intermittent renewables and reliable thermal and nuclear generators. So given that the very high profitability of renewables, entirely propped up by government subsidies and government mandates, and the losses incurred by the thermal generators, it's unsurprising that you have overinvestment in renewables and underinvestment in the thermal generation that you need to keep the lights on. And this is what you can see in the next chart. There's been a decline in renewable generation. It's basically from 2010 to 2020, in a decade, it's fallen by 28.5%. Nearly 3/4 of that decline is accounted for by coal being forced off the grid, whereas the intermittent wind and solar has steadily climbed. And what that has meant is that for every 1 gigawatt of wind capacity in 2009, there was over 18 gigawatts of reliable thermal generation. In 2020, that ratio turned from 1 gigawatt of wind and solar to 1.7 gigawatts of non-intermittent capacity. So what you've got is a degradation of the reliability and of the grid. Now, key point is that the government initially said, oh, we want to replace coal with new gas. But the new gas capacity, because the erosion of the profitability of thermal, never arrived. You can't make a private sector investment case for new gas capacity. They're competing against subsidized wind and solar, plus they have to pay the costs, they pick up the costs of the intermittency of wind and solar. So what you end up with is basically, if you subsidize wind and solar, you actually have to subsidize everything. As the energy secretary in 2015, Amber Rudd, she just come into the job, said in 2015, we now have an electricity system in which no form of power generation, not even gas-fired power stations, can be built without government intervention. That's a big, big problem. And now we come to the fundamental fact of renewables and the so-called energy transition. Energy regression, I think, would be a more appropriate term. And that is, it consumes more capital to produce less energy. As you can see from the next chart, this is looking at the output per megawatt of generating capacity. In 2009, 1 megawatt of generating capacity produced 4,312 megawatt hours of electricity. In 2010, 1 megawatt hour of generating capacity produced 3,994 megawatt hours of electricity, a decline of over 28%. And this is the big point. A 15.5% increase in generating capacity produced 17% less electricity. And by the way, you end up with a less reliable grid for all that capital. I'd now like to turn to Britain's decision to adopt net zero in 2019, as it illustrates a broader point relevant to the debate on net zero in the United States. And that is total policy capture by the climate industrial complex. Britain adopted net zero on the basis that the costs of renewable energy, especially offshore wind, were low and falling. The wind lobby sold the government the falsehood that offshore wind costs were around £50 per megawatt hour, when in reality their break-even costs are well in excess of £100 per megawatt hour. Far from low and falling, renewable costs are high and rising. And that's before taking account of their intermittency costs and the extra grid infrastructure that they need. Politicians, government departments, and the media all parroted and still parrot the falsehood that renewable energy is cheap. And the victims of this are British families, British businesses, and the overall performance of the British economy, which, as David mentioned, in terms of growth and productivity, is recording its worst performance since 1780. So what to do about this? My answer is, first step is open the books. All renewable projects benefiting from any form of government support, whether production tax credit, state renewable portfolio standards, consumer-funded grid connections, should file annual statements of operating financial data on a consistent basis so everyone can see the claims of the renewable lobby for what they are. And I'd like to finish with this point at this stage. Because achieving net zero is impossible, each step towards net zero costs more than the previous one. So the costs of decarbonisation rise exponentially. So far from net zero saving the planet, what net zero will actually do, before you even get there, it will destroy your economy. With that, I'd like to turn to Mark, if I can. And when I was researching this and writing this, the conclusion I came to is that wind is a dead-end technology. The latest generation of wind turbines are highly engineered. They probably extract as much as they can from the wind, and their performance has actually been quite disappointing. What do you say to that hypothesis?
Well, first of all, Rupert, that's excellent. And, you're speaking the truth that we all know. Net zero is impossible. The real issue on the table is how much economic destruction is incurred on the Western nations, because China's certainly not doing this, and neither is Africa. So it really is serious stuff. To answer your question on wind turbines, I mean, I like wind turbines. I've been in wind farms that go to the horizon in China. They're amazing machines. Humans are great at building giant machines. Engineers love to have those challenges. But I'll just say that we're definitely at the end game on wind turbine in every respect, cost efficiency. Three things about wind turbines, just to talk about the technology of those machines, because they're the epicenter of the aspirations. Solar is starting rise to try to replace wind turbines, as you know, in the funding aspirations. First, they're at the limits of economies of scale. All engineering machines can be built and benefit from economies of scale. You build bigger boats, bigger ships for transport, bigger airplanes, bigger rocket ships. Economies of scale are a magical thing, but all engineered things have a limit, and engineers typically build to the limit till they find out where it is. The A380 ran into diseconomies of scale, biggest consumer commercial aircraft ever built, and that's why they stopped building them. Essentially, the wind turbines today are moving into the A380 category. They've passed the limits of useful economic efficiency. In fact, they also passed the limit in part because their size as a share of grid electricity reaches a point of disefficiencies. To your point that they're episodic power, grids can handle episodic power if the episodic power is a small share of a grid. If the grids are built with a large share of episodic power, especially wind that's unpredictable, grid stability and reliability collapses. So the two economies of scale we're at or near limits. The other, the sort of the triad of the limits to wind, to your point on efficiency of design, wind turbines are very close to their physics limits. There's a limit for wind turbines called the Betz limit. It's sort of the equivalent to how fast propeller airplanes can fly. Propeller airplanes, when they were invented, flew faster and faster until they get close to the speed of sound. Because they used wind, air to fly faster, they can't go faster than the speed of sound. They just don't. It's not possible. You had to make a different kind of engine, the jet engine. The Betz limit tells you how much kinetic energy you can extract out of moving air. It's 42 and 43%. I forget the exact number. I apologize. But wind turbines are pushing in the high 30s now. So you get a few percentage points. It's not going to be more efficient. Finally, and oh, by the way, there's other things people talk about, better materials, lighter blades. Again, we're on the asymptote of limited gains in efficiency, incremental. The final thing is that as you see at all engineered systems, you increase your efficiency of production. As you go into scale, You find the costs per unit go down because the industry scale up and they get better at manufacturing, they get better at organizing, they get better at supply chains. And again, this is just like all manufactured products. They go from high cost to manufacture as they scale up in terms of the magnitude of the production itself, not the size of the machine. They get economies of scale and production efficiency. Those also always end. And then you get on the asymptote of what's called Wright's curve. You get 1 or 2% better a year because of you just continue to learn a little bit better with labor, with supply chains. But what happens is that you end up getting the inputs, when you get to the limits of efficiency of manufacturing, the inputs themselves dominate the cost of the inputs. The materials you need to build the thing start to dominate. So wind turbines are essentially at that point. Changes in the cost of concrete, steel, and fiberglass and the power electronics utterly dominate the marginal cost of wind turbine. And what's happened is wind turbine costs have gone up recently because the cost of the input materials are soaring. In a delicious irony, I'll end at this point, one of the reasons the cost of the inputs go up is their energy-intensive inputs. Steel and concrete use lots of hydrocarbons. If governments make hydrocarbons more expensive, the cost of their wind turbine machines goes up and becomes dominated by those features. So they'll come up with clever new designs, but there is no magic there's no magic invention. There's no Moore's law in wind. Wind and solar and energy producing machines follow the laws of thermodynamics and inertia and machines. They don't follow Moore's law. And the trope in the pro-energy transition community is that there's a tech exponential change in all these machines because they call it energy tech. It's a complete misapplication of what the word tech means. It won't happen. It can't happen, to use your word. It's impossible. So well done, Rupert. Hope everybody reads it and pays attention.
Thank you so much, Mark. Buddy, I was wondering if, when I was going through what one can see in the British energy and the British electricity system, is there anything that rings any bells, anything similar with what you're seeing in, say, New York or California?
Well, there are similarities, but the good news for us is that we are way behind. And we're never going to catch up, I don't think, to where Britain is now. I could use either New York or California as an example for in a concession to the shortness of time. Let me use New York because I live here and follow it more closely. And I'm just going to get some New York statistics up on my own screen here. New York passed in 2019, which I guess that might be the same year that Britain had its climate net zero law. New York passed a net zero law. And with regard to electricity, that law passed in 2019 says that the percent of electricity from renewables will reach 70% by 2030. At the time, the percent of electricity from wind and solar was about 5%, or between 5 and 6%. We're now in 2024, they've gotten it up to 8%. And now, that's wind and solar. Now, we have a deep secret here in New York, which is cheating in the way of renewables, which is we have a gigantic waterfall, Niagara Falls. And Niagara Falls, some people count it as renewable and some don't. I think they're counting it as renewable. It provides 25% of our electricity for the whole state. One waterfall, that gigantic waterfall. Well, we don't have another one. So that 25%, with all the other hydro in the state, we got, I misstated that, it's 20%, but with all the other hydro in our state, we get slightly more than 20% of our power from hydro, and it's not going to change. And it's about 8% from wind and solar. We closed 2 nuclear plants. We had, well, actually 3 nuclear facilities, 2 of which are way upstate where nobody's ever seen them. And the other one was fairly close to the city in a populated area. The people hated it. So We closed them in 2020 and 2021. We closed that provided 25% of New York City's power. What did we do? Oh, we built 2 gigantic new natural gas plants in the far suburbs of New York City. So our carbon emissions since that Climate Act have actually gone up substantially because we built 2 natural gas plants. Well, now the governor and the legislature say we're going to close all the fossil fuel plants and build massive amounts of wind and solar to replace them. That process has gotten absolutely nowhere at this point. So in 2020 and 21, they took bids for about 5 gigawatts of offshore wind power. And in 2023, and the prices came in about $80 to $90 per megawatt hour. In 2023, the developers canceled all of them, every single one, and said that they need prices more like $150 to $170 a megawatt hour to make these things work. And the state said they're not going to do it. And so they're in the process of starting a rebid on that. Meanwhile, in October, October 2023, they took some other bids, which they accepted for new and different projects in the range of $150 per megawatt hour. We'll see if that ever gets off the ground. Meanwhile, in 2024, which is almost halfway between when they passed the act and when we're supposed to be at 70% of our electricity from renewables, we don't have one single offshore wind turbine. We don't have one under construction. We don't have one that's even gotten to the permitting process yet. That's where it is. So I think it is never, ever going to happen, but we're counting on Britain to completely fall apart and show us why it can't happen in order to be able to develop the political will to pull the plug. So there you go.
Thank you very much, Bunny. What I can tell you is both main political parties are completely committed to net zero. So
I'm aware of that.
I think you'll see. Think you'll see that outcome. Andy, if I can come to you now, sky high electricity rates in Britain. You also see very high electricity rates in California. Yet America has vast energy resources. Expensive energy is a policy choice. It's not an act of nature. How can awareness be raised that actually this is what is at stake?
Well, yeah, back in 2021, Larry Fink at BlackRock came out with his annual letter to CEOs, and one of the comments in it was that a transition to net zero demanded a transformation of the entire economy. And I think your report, what you show in your report, is that transformation would be a disastrous event for our economy, as it is increasingly proving to be in Great Britain, in the UK. And if we don't learn the lesson from UK and from your report, I'm not sure how we could learn it. So as people have mentioned, back in 2008. Your parliament said that they were going to hit 80% decarbonization. They changed that to 100% or net zero in 2019. It's a luxury, or really it's a luxury policy. I like to call it champagne socialism, which will only the rich could afford. It's going to devastate. We're going to be devastating not only businesses in Britain and in the United States, but also ordinary Britons there and ordinary Americans here that are just trying to heat their homes and get to work. And if they don't see, if the cost of this transition isn't enough, I think when the heat doesn't come on or the electricity doesn't come on, in addition to the cost, they're going to suffer the very real consequences of this. So it's even before what I tried to do, Rupert, was take all the brilliance in your report and put it into something that I could understand. With hopefully then being able to relate it to other people so they could understand. But what I got out of it was that since 2020, Britons have been paying about 75% more for electricity than Americans. And during the 2022 energy crisis, rates for businesses actually were double what American businesses are paying. And these these surging energy costs are really result from two things. One is cap and trade policies in the UK, and the other is renewable subsidies that you've been talking about. But the impact of cap and trade, given the numbers in your report, it has been really astounding. I expected them to be big, and I was shocked at how large they were. But you came up with numbers that showed that the cost to generate electricity in 2022, the cost imposed by carbon, these carbon taxes, was $128 per megawatt hour for coal-generated electricity, and $51 an hour for natural gas. And those costs, of course, are on top of the actual fuel cost, which are at $150 per megawatt hour for electricity from coal and $160 per megawatt hour for natural gas. So you were paying $278 an hour for 1 megawatt hour of electricity, and $211 for one generated by coal. $278 generated by gas, $278 generated by coal, $211 generated by gas. In the US, we had much lower costs, obviously, even though people complain about the fuel costs. We have no cap and trade, so we don't have that expense. And then second, for coal, we've got these old and British operated, these old and inefficiently operated British coal plants with lower thermal efficiencies in the US. So coal is more expensive. In addition to cap and trade, it's more expensive because of the inefficiencies. And for natural gas, it's just much cheaper when you pipe natural gas, as we do in the United States. Maybe not as much as we could, given what President Biden has done over the past week or so. But it's still cheaper to pipe it than it is to have it shipped, liquefied and shipped, which is what you do in Europe. So in the US, the cost per megawatt hour for electricity generated from coal, according to your report, was $27 per megawatt hour versus $278 in Britain. And the cost per megawatt hour for coal was for gas was $61 in the United States versus that $211 in Britain. It's no wonder that there's an energy crisis that's causing such hardship, not only for British businesses, but for ordinary Britons. And then on top of that, you have the cost of subsidizing all of these politically favored wind and solar projects that Mel and Buddy have been talking about, which obviously add to the cost of generating power. And they've actually, while the Big Six showed wind and solar profits in 2008 and 2009 because of the subsidies, it actually increased the cost of gas and coal-fired power plants from 60 megawatt hours 60 pounds per megawatt hour in 2013 to up to a very significant number higher than that by 2020. So you've got all of these elements kind of chiming in the UK to increase energy costs. As you said, both parties seem to continue to be supportive of advancing these net zero policies. Now that probably won't happen in the United States. I think Congress is going to pass anything like the British Parliament did with, I think they spent like half an hour or 45 minutes debating this net zero carbon emissions bill and then passed it. But it's not going to stop the Biden administration from doing what it can administratively with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which with anything that comes out of the Biden administration, just assume that whatever the name of the bill is, it will do exactly the opposite of what the name is. And of course, that's been the case with every bill that's come out with them, particularly bills concerning energy. So I think what we need to do is get the word out about the extremely negative impacts of what would happen if we tried to do this net zero transformation. Your report shows the terrible impacts coming out of the UK, so that's something we need to spread. But I have to say, until those costs start to hit ordinary Americans, I don't know how much focus it's going to get. Much like immigration, until immigration started to impact people in all these sanctuary cities, nothing was ever going to be done about it. And now we're starting to see some reaction. We're going to need to see a reaction, and people either have to understand their bills are going to increase, or they're going to have to see the actual increases themselves.
Thank you very much, Andy. Terry, if I can come to you, in a lot of financial market commentary, Net zero and the energy transition is talked of as a done deal. It's something that's inevitable, unstoppable, irreversible. Do you think that perception might be changing? Well, there might be some awareness that there are downsides. It's not good. It's not a flower-strewn path to net zero.
Well, I would be very worried, Rupert, about those for whom the perceptions have not yet changed. We've gone through the last 2-3 years of market reality that should have wakened everyone up, and of course has led to a reversal of ESG flows. Some data, quick data, ever since the invasion of the Ukraine, oil and gas stocks went from peak to trough up 80%. At the same time that the stock market was down 18%. And then, of course, last year, 2023, we finally saw the shakeout in clean energy stocks, which were down more than 28% at a time when the market itself was up about 25%. So anyone who is not realizing that this path to a green energy nirvana is not strewn with risks and potential losses for one's portfolio is simply not, frankly, obviously is not running a portfolio. I think the shakeout that you talk about also has to be on a forward-looking basis. What's very clear from your research, and I join the others in congratulating you on your paper, is that the right national security solution is an energy abundant solution. Affordable, reliable energy systems are effectively a national security issue. And the only way to guarantee that we're making those decisions intelligently is to open the books. But I would still remind everyone on the call that we are facing, as always, an uncertain future. And what is happening across a lot of financial markets is the increasing price of uncertainty. So, for example, in the great state of Florida, where David oftentimes spends his time when it's colder up here in the north, it has become impossible to buy homeowner insurance at any reasonable rate because it is very much expected that we will continue to have devastating storms rake across Florida. The nature of how climate risks themselves will continue to manifest themselves in asset prices is real and is here to stay. Climate risk is, in fact, investment risk. But let's be very clear, to think that you're solving it by pouring all your money into a green energy stock or by taking all of your money out of oil and gas stocks, when in fact we are still very dependent on those energy sources. And it's very clear through your research and the research of others that the renewables cannot possibly displace them at any time. This is the IEA, at any time in a reasonable future. Let us make sure that we continue to have balanced portfolios that represent the reality of the economy rather than some presumed nirvana. And I'll just close by saying that the expectations that I think many people have had to work into their new models are that, broadly speaking, de-emphasizing energy sectors upon which we are very reliant and overemphasizing energy sectors in one's portfolio that are proving to be illusory and overpriced has been very painful and will continue to be painful.
Thank you very much, Terry. And to the Charles Dickens of our time, Joel, if I may. One of the things, as I was doing the research for the report, I read the British Treasury's assessment, net zero assessment, and there's some real giveaways in there. They acknowledge that net zero is regressive because energy costs are a much higher proportion of low-income household budgets. And they also implicitly acknowledge that it accelerates deindustrialization. They talked about white-collar consultants and so forth benefiting from the energy transition. The implication of what they say about carbon leakage is that blue-collar employment will take a bit of a knock. Can you speak to the differential class impacts of of net zero?
Yeah, first of all, I liked your presentation. I look forward to reading the paper, but you know, you sort of know what my hot buttons are. So, you know, in terms of class, I look at two different issues. Here in the state of California, the impact on energy, and we're doing a report right now on the future of Latinos in California, written by 4 Latinas actually, but it's basically what happens is Latinos are, for instance, who are the bulk of the working class in most of the southwestern United States, are engaged in activities that are affected by net zero policies. They pay higher rates themselves, and that's an issue. But the other thing is that the industries that have historically been the motors of upward mobility for working class people, you know, in agricultural processing, logistics, the port, obviously manufacturing, home construction, because California, it's not just a priority, it is an obsession to turn everything into a climate issue. You can't build suburban single family homes that people want because of climate reasons. And a lot of it is sort of, you know, nonsense. But the reality is that working class people are hurt the hardest. Now, of course, the great irony is AI may wipe out a lot of those professional jobs, so kind of serves them right. But the reality is that in California, we can tell what is exactly happening. And you know what my colleague Soledad Osura is writing about right now is that you know, in our report, that Latinos are overwhelmingly in the carbon economy, and so they are incredibly vulnerable, and have been vulnerable, and that's why, for instance, Blacks and Hispanics in California actually do much worse adjusted for cost than they do in other states. I mean, actually, among African Americans, the adjusted income for African Americans in California is slightly lower than Mississippi. So the real impacts of energy, but not just the price of energy for the home, but for the businesses and what it means. And of course, then, you know, if you're telling, you know, companies that you've got to, you know, explain every aspect of your carbon emissions, that's not going to encourage you to go there, because who wants to have every time an employee gets on an airplane counted against you? So that's one part. The other part, just briefly, I think is even more important, which is the geopolitics and the, you know, if you want to say the global class structure, which is, while we're deindustrializing, and you know, Britain is, you know, particularly pathetic, but as we're deindustrializing, what's happening is that other countries who are not signing on to net zero are moving ahead. So, for instance, when, you know, sometimes you have to wonder whether there's some Qatari lobbyist in the Biden administration. You know, if you wipe the U.S. out as or you limit its exports of natural gas, guess who wins? The Russians and the Qataris and the Iranians. Well, isn't that a coincidence? And somehow somebody's got to realize that, you know, we are essentially at the beginning of some sort of global conflict, and we're basically handing everything over to, you know, it would be as if we kept selling the Japanese oil after Pearl Harbor. You know, this is basically a completely self-defeating policy. And the last part is the developing world, and particularly Africa. I work a lot with the South Africans. You know, they're not going to go this way. They're building new coal plants. They're wanting to use natural gas, and obviously China's doing it. So the great irony is we're going to destroy the industrial base with Chinese-made products for the green energy that are generated by coal. I think, you know, I don't know if Dickens would like that story, but it's pretty ironic. So, you know, fundamentally, what we've forgotten is what the impact on both the national and the global political economy is, and we've just ignored this completely because our elites are, you know, completely disconnected from reality.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I was one of the things that surprised me in researching the report was coal, the relative cost of coal and natural gas in the United States, because I kind of, the impression one gets is fracking came along, natural gas prices tumbled, which is true, but coal for the last 10, 15 years, since 2008, I think there's only been 1 year when it's been cheaper to generate electricity from natural gas than from coal. And coal is far and away both the cheapest and most reliable form of energy to use for electricity generation. And the demonization of coal has proceeded enormously. I mean, in Britain, we've virtually all the coal-fired power stations have been knocked down. And if you look at focus groups and so forth, public opinion surveys, very, very hostile to coal. And yet coal will be the dominant way of generating electricity for most of the global south, and for very good reasons. And COP28 in Dubai completely, in saying we're going to power past coal, so completely ignored the reality that the global south is going to carbonize, and it's going to use more coal, it's going to burn more coal because it wants to join the modern world. I'm just looking if we've got any questions from people who are listening in.
If I could just jump in a quick second. As someone who's a layperson to this stuff, it's hard not to walk away from the conclusions that high prices, scarcity, and unreliability, right, in this net zero kind of push, it's not a bug, but a feature. I mean, it seems like the logic of this stuff is to create a certain amount of privation. And that privation, I think, to Joel's point, really does hit the lower and middle classes. But it's, like, one of the things I think that I don't think the American consumer has done, there seems to be a built-in green inflation that's never going to go away. That as long as you stay committed to these things, the price of energy is going to be high and it's going to be passed through all goods. Is our economy that, strong? That it can actually, while we're doing half the UK, not as crazy as that, that the commitments that we've made thus far. I mean, do you see that as healthy to our economy or not? Nothing to worry about here.
I think there's a lot to worry about the US, because what's happened is, particularly with electricity generation is in the hands of basically the green blob. I mean, the EPA has got a rulemaking out there which wants to take coal off the grid and make a lot of and be very damaging to the economics of natural gas generation. And high electricity prices are really, really bad news. One of the questions that's just come up, and if anyone wants to ask a question, please use the Q&A dialogue box at the bottom of the screen. How are British people reacting to the energy crisis? And this is a really interesting question, because we did go through an acute energy crisis, and the government poured billions into subsidizing electricity bills. But what the public was persuaded by was high energy costs were Vladimir Putin's fault, and the way we insulate ourselves is by increasing our dependency on wind power, because Putin can't stop the wind blowing. I mean, it really is as kind of dare I say it, mental as that. And so they kind of bought the story that wind power can't be taken away by nasty foreign dictators. What they haven't been told is as Andy's pointed out, a very high proportion of the increase in electricity costs were due to the incredible increase in the carbon allowances, the emissions allowances under what is now the successor to the European Union's emissions trading scheme. Britain had, after we left the European Union, we devised our own way of taxing our energy, and a huge proportion of the increased energy costs is because of increase in most entirely artificial carbon allowances. And I did a counterfactual. If we had a what would the world like? What would the energy market look like in Britain if Britain hadn't powered past coal and imposed these carbon taxes? And you'd have been talking about electricity prices would be around half what they turned out to be, even at the most acute stage of the post-Putin, post-February 2022 invasion. So a lot of this is a policy-induced crisis. We've got a question for Terry. What has been the impact on net zero so far on financial markets in Britain or elsewhere in Europe?
Well, I think we talked about it a little bit earlier, Rupert, which is some distortion with regard to asset prices, specifically in the clean energy sector. Clean energy stocks peaked in 2021, unsurprisingly, at about the same time that we found ourselves dangerously reliant on oil and gas stocks that were plummeting. So I think I tried to give some of that data earlier. Clean energy stocks down 25% last year, and a time when the market was up 25%. Certainly not a way to build a safe portfolio. What I would say is that I do not necessarily regard clean energy stocks today as being mispriced or a certain area to lose money. There will continue to be a lot of public capital that is poured into these areas, distorting prices, but still creating opportunities. I see Mark also nodding his head. So I don't want to leave anyone on the phone with this idea that clean energy is a straight down and other forms of energy are a straight up. But it is remarkable, is it not, Rupert, that the example that was brought up in the state of New York, that here we are de-emphasizing nuclear power at precisely the time when it presents itself as a tremendous solution. There's a great deal going on in private capital markets with regard to small nuclear, small modular reactors, SMRs, and other opportunities where I'm happy to say that there is not a dearth of capital available. There's quite a bit of capital that is available. I would, also remark, as some people are saying, in the United States, comparing it to Britain, no, you have to look at it state by state. And thank God for Texas and some other states that are genuinely looking to have a widely diversified but still broadly abundant energy mix. We need diversity in our energy forms, and capital markets are going to continue to be an important part of that solution. I hope that was a helpful response.
Terrence, can I just add on to that real quickly? It's clear that both things can be true. Rupert's economic destruction of the middle and lower middle class by high cost energy because of the torrent of capital flowing from governments to prop up and subsidize inherently unproductive energy machines. That creates opportunity for investors to make money, of course. And so I, like you, I don't have any doubt there'll be lots more windmills, electric cars, even without government intervention. But the torrent of capital, it's got to go somewhere. I also think it's inflationary, separate issue. But I would point out the one part of the capital markets, and this, that's been hammered, that the government has crowded out. Venture capital in clean tech has just fallen off a cliff. Because if you want to put unless you're in the food chain of preferences for what the government's going to give up grants for, there's $100 billion of grants in the Inflation Reduction Act waiting to be gushed into the market for the preferred, and you know what that means in government markets, inventors of new technologies. Capital markets just run from that, right? This is a lobbying game, not an innovation game. Here's the irony. It kills innovation. Government does a lock-in. So you can make money on the lock-in, but it does technological lock-in, which is the polar opposite of what we're being told it would create.
Thanks, Mark. We've got a question now for Andy. What parts of the US economy do you think would be most badly hit by rising prices if the US followed the UK's path, net zero path?
I mean, every business would be here. Every business uses energy. I mean, you at the very least, you have to heat your building if you're in a retail business to keep the lights on. But then you go up to manufacturing and construction, and you use huge amounts of energy. So it really would depend upon the dependence on of the particular sector on energy. How much energy do you consume? But everybody's going to be affected by this. Not only the big consumers, but also the smallest consumers, because everybody wants to keep the lights on. Everybody wants to keep the place warm in the winter and cooled off in the summer.
Thanks, Sandy. Another one for Mark. If wind energy is reaching the limits of what it can achieve from an engineering standpoint, what other sources of future technologies offer the most promise, in your opinion?
Well, it's easy. I mean, so the biggest promise is in the biggest phenomenology, which is nuclear energy. Obviously, there's nothing that competes. Going from hydrocarbons and nuclear energy reduces footprint and materials use by 1,000%. Going from hydrocarbons to wind and solar increases footprint and materials use by 1,000%. So do the math on that and figure in terms of potential. But it'll take a while to get the new nukes designed and built and manufacturable at scale. Guessing a decade, I mean, that would be fast. In the meantime, the greatest potential is greater use and greater efficient use of hydrocarbons. The headroom in making internal combustion engines better is 2 to 3 times greater than the headroom to make electric motors and wind turbines and solar arrays better. They're near physics limits. We're nowhere near the Carnot physics limits for internal combustion engines, not even close. And so there's huge potential in increasing the inherent efficiency of hydrocarbon machines, which is completely ignored. It's the Toyota story of hybrids versus all electric. Toyota was right. The chairman was right. He got fired for that.
Thanks very much, Mark. There's one for Joel. The elites are not stupid. Does he think that net zero may be a necessary part of the elite plan to reduce the population of the planet?
Well, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist because I think people are too self-interested and stupid to do them. But there is confluence of interests. There's one, I can make a lot, like Janet Yellen gets up there and says, this is the great opportunity of our times. Well, if you're Elon Musk and you became a rich guy because of mandates on electric vehicles, I guess it is a great opportunity. So, but I think it's various interest groups. And the other part is the wealthy are insulated from this. Energy costs isn't a big deal to them. I mean, look, I ride my bike or go to my school's an 8-minute drive away. I maybe use a tank of gas a month. If I'm a construction worker at Riverside working on a project in Irvine, and I'm driving and I have to drive a truck to work, I'm screwed. So I think that, I don't think it's a conspiracy per se, although I do think that there are class interests. I thought I was looking at the Rasmussen report recently, which was just fascinating, where they said the 1% of the population that was Ivy League educated, lives in big cities, and makes over $150,000 a year, they want to ban gas cars. Their views on life are the views of somebody who lives in Manhattan and makes lots of money, and has nothing to do with how the vast majority of people work. And this is so I don't think it's a conspiracy from the top that's coordinated, but I think there's a lot of self-interests involved. And of course, you not only have the oligarchs with what they want, you also have this enormous professional class who they benefit, at least in the short run, by ever more regulation, ever more gaining control over people's lives. That's what they do. Sometimes last night I saw again the Lives of Others, with a great movie about East Germany. well, it's becoming more and more familiar to somebody living in California.
Thanks very much, Joel. I'd like to close with that's been a fantastic discussion. I'd like to close with a couple of points. The first is with the very popular among policy wonk circles is all of the above energy policy, because I think the British experience shows that if the government subsidizes some of the above, you end up having to subsidize all of the above if you want to keep the lights on. And that leads to a government takeover of the grid, and we know where that leads. You land straight in the hands of the climate industrial complex. And the second point is the recent decision, the decision last week by the Biden administration to impose a pause on new permits for LNG export, something Joel touched on. I have no words to describe the stupidity of this decision. Actually, I do, because I've written something in The Spectator, which I think should be on the site today. Britain and Europe depend on US LNG surge capacity to keep the lights on. Biden has essentially thrown America's transatlantic allies straight under the bus. I mean, Joel suggests there's some Qatari deep money in there, but it is absolutely extraordinary. And I think that brings into focus the very sharp contrast between Joe Biden's energy isolationism and Donald Trump's doctrine of American energy dominance, which was about using America's vast reserves of energies to support America's allies rather than cut them off at the knees. Anyhow, with that, I'll hand back to David.
And I'll hand back everybody's day to them. I just want to say thank you very much for those who have been listening and have questions or still want to talk to anybody on that list. I would just ask you to go through Nathan Harden. But the goal of these is to kind of start a conversation to kind of tee things off, so the people in the press who have the responsibility to educate, citizens and legislators have the opportunity to kind of, jump into a deep dive conversation with people with the capacity for the swim. So thank you all for coming. Have a good week. And if you write something, send something. I'm sure RealClear would like to kind of give it the love that it deserves. But thank you, Rupert, for this report. Thank you, gentlemen, for kind of participating on it. And next time you write something, we'll do it for you. Thank you.